To welcome. I will start over. Hi, everyone. We're so excited to welcome you to our literary event. My name is Julie, and I'm a member of the Korean American Artists Collective, or KAAC. On behalf of all of us on the KAAC core team, welcome. Tonight's event is in conjunction with the Jeong Project. We launched Jeong this past spring as a response to the ongoing anti-Asian hate crimes that culminated in the Atlanta shootings that occurred in March. As artists, our responses to these events was one of grief and anger, but also an urge to organize, to create, and to use our art to heal and come together. We invited 23 Korean American artists and writers to contribute to a limited edition portfolio of art and writing by and for Korean American women, all centered around the theme of Jeong. Thanks to generous donations from 103 backers on Indiegogo, including many of you, last month we were able to raise $12,580 for the Jeong Project. These funds will allow us to produce the Jeong portfolio, which is currently in production and scheduled to be released on our website later this fall. A portion of these funds, along with ticket sales from today's event and sales from the remaining Jeong portfolios, will be going to the 4 AAPI organizations that we continue to support through this project: Haneul Family Alliance, Red Canary Song, Nakasek, and AAPI Women Lead. We want to thank you for all your continued support for our artists and for our AAPI communities, and for showing up here today. We do need to announce that one of our writers, Andy Mara, will unfortunately not be able to attend to join us this evening, as her flight has been delayed due to inclement weather. But we are so excited to have two of the participating Jeong Project writers here with us now, Franny Choi and Arhm Choi Wild. And I'm very excited to introduce our moderator, the super talented Alex Sujong Laughlin. Alex is a writer and video producer. She's made podcasts for companies like New York Times, NBC, and First Look Media. She previously worked at BuzzFeed and the Washington Post, where she created Other, Mixed Race in America, a podcast about multiracial identity. She lives in New Haven, Connecticut, with her husband and cat. Thank you, Alex, for being here with us today. I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks everybody and KAAC for hosting this wonderful event. I am going to start off by introducing our two writers. So I'll start with Franny. So Franny Choi is the author of Soft Science and Floating Brilliant Gone. A graduate of the Helen Zell Writers Program, she co-hosts the podcast Verses with Dana Smith and teaches at Williams College. Arhm Choi Wild is a queer Korean American poet who grew up in the slam community of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Their debut book of poems, Cut to Bloom, was the winner of the 2019 Write Bloody Prize. Arhm is a Kundiman Fellow with an MFA in poetry from Sarah Lawrence College, and their work appears in Barrow Street, the Massachusetts Review, Pleiades, Split This Rock, and other publications. They work as the director of Progressive Teaching of the Progressive Teaching Institute and as a diversity coordinator at a school in New York City. Reading is a little difficult. Welcome, Arhm and Franny. We're so excited. So just to give the audience a quick roadmap for what we're about to do. So Arhm and Franny will read a few poems each, and then we'll have a conversation. And then at about 7:45, we'll switch over to audience Q&A. So please feel free to leave questions in the chat, and we will make sure to pluck them out and ask them. So with that being said, Franny, do you want to start by reading some of your poems?
Yeah. Thank you, Alex, for that awesome introduction, and thank you all. Oh, and I see that Steph is putting some links in the chat. Thank you so much, Steph, and thank you all for being here. It's so wonderful to gather in a Korean and Korean American space. It's like always so much of a gift to get to share any space at all with my sibling Arhm. So yeah, so just like, thank you. And I think that like, I mean, yeah, of all the things that have come out of all the things that have happened as a result of the tragic and enraging killings in Atlanta, where I partly grew up and where my parents live, out of all the things to come out of that, for the Jeong Project to be one of them is, and to get to be part of it is such an incredible honor and gift. So thank you all for everybody who has made this project happen. It means a lot to me. Okay, I'm gonna read a few poems. This first one is about the way that I am very bad at knowing the lyrics to any songs, which is why I love karaoke, because they provide you the lyrics, you know? So yeah. Dinesh says they want to lose themselves in bops they can't sing along to. And I'm thinking of the years I spent sweating to the choreo of every K-pop song with a decent dance break. Me and the other girls from church, practically saintly in our diligence as we rehearsed our isolations and body rolls, winding and rewinding the tapes, our noses merely grazing the screen, though, in truth, I only understood maybe about half the words. The other half mostly sounds, which nevertheless sank into my muscles, pathways laid by so many hours of industrious mouthing that now, while humming idly some stupid tune at the sink, I'll realize for the first time ever what that line meant. Though, of course, pop everywhere is a language so reliable it's nearly nothing. Baby, let me know, and I need you in my arms on babbling loop through the ages. And I'm thinking, too, about how this, my first love of losing myself in the scaffolds and percussives of an unparsed lyric, doomed me for life to never be able to actually hear the words to any songs, even in English, even my favorites, like Jamila's, which I put on when I'm adrift and sunken and just need to feel at home in something. Even those harbors are built mostly of sonics. Not gibberish, I mean, but language so sacred it's not my place to try to decipher it. Phonemes holy as stones on a string, mysterious as the names we give to animals or the words we know only in prayer. At Rebecca's mother's funeral, for example, where, when invited, I added my small voice to the reciting of the Kaddish, and the perfect thunder of it lifted one part of me higher than air, while rooting another deep into the fragrant earth, a bit of which I later scooped as gently as I could bear onto the casket, the shovel heavier than any word I knew, and more full of light than even the birds overhead, who, as we wept, kept, of course, right on saying exactly whatever they needed to say. Okay. Oh, thanks. Thanks, friends. I was reading Grace M. Cho's incredible book about the sort of ghosts of I think haunting the Korean diaspora, which is like this incredible mix of scholarly and creative writing. And there was this, there kept being like facts that showed up just kind of like in the course of the book about the Korean War and its kind of like various psychological effects, psychic effects. And I kept running into facts that would just sort of like wreck me, in passing. And so this is one of the poems that I wrote in the course of reading that book. It's called Upon Learning That Some Korean War Refugees Used Partially Detonated Napalm Canisters as Cooking Fuel. Somewhere in a prior world, a woman with my face is scraping the seeds from an unborn hell. All night, doom rang from the sky. And in the morning, there are mouths to feed. There are crocks in the cellar and the ruined crops, the early frost, the neighbor's red daughter strung up in the square. What else to do when the unspeakable comes? What to burn when it doesn't? Somewhere in a world that didn't quite end, a woman like me is foraging for that which failed to kill her. She is cranking open modernity's throat, wrenching her arc from its scat. She is a woman who can hack an impossible morning into water, bean paste, bitter leaves, another chance to fumble toward the next chance and the next. Every day of my life has been something other than my last. Every day an extinction misfires and I put it to work. And that the ending of that poem definitely owes a debt to Lucille Clifton, one of the great geniuses of the American poetic tradition. This one is called Who Died and Made You American? And I think that it's also a good time to acknowledge that I'm zooming in here from Northampton, Massachusetts, which is land, unceded land that was once stewarded by the Nonotuck people and Pecumtuck people, and was the home of many different tribes and nations here in the northwest of this continent. Northeast of this continent, sorry. Who died and made you American? Who waded through the corpse flood? Who splayed as they ran? Who begged at the mercy of rot-faced soldiers? Who said, honey, honey, and sold American cigarettes for barley and bone? Whose body shone in the river? Whose roof blown off? Whose America flung back into slur? Whose beautiful? Whose country split clean? Whose bombs ended the war, the world? Who split whose seam? Who ran colonized from catastrophe and was extinguished? Which enemies? Who monster? What mothered from that wrong? Who freed into aftermath? Whose husband flew? Who stayed and grew and stayed and grew? Who left? Who left alone with 8 hungers? Who left home for Miguk? Who lifted into the air? Who paid taxes here? Who paid? Who paid? Whose ghosts greening these fields? Whose language in these rivers, the borders, Milwaukee, Muskogee, Connecticut? Who died here and fled? Who fled here and lived, sold and lived, dissolved into translation and were not forgotten? I'm the corpse flower here. I'm a settler, indebted, guilty of living. We died, and I live here, now, in the beautiful country. America was always a slur. Okay, and then finally, I'll read the poem that I submitted it to be part of the Jeong Project. And once again, I think for this, I just want to say, like, I'm just so grateful to get to be part of this with so many incredible Korean American and Korean artists, and especially gathering around the concept of Jeong is like ingenious and good for my heart. So thank you. So it's called Demilitarized Zone, and it takes place in the future. I roll my suitcase through the demilitarized airport. I hand my demilitarized ticket to the demilitarized agent at the gate, who smiles in a demilitarized way, points with an open hand. On the plane, I order a demilitarized orange juice. I look down at the demilitarized mountains of Siberia and imagine walking on them. We land on the demilitarized runway, and the captain's voice over the loudspeaker is demilitarized as he asks us to stay in our seats. In the bathroom, I brush my demilitarized teeth. I get on the wrong demilitarized train and have to plead with the conductor who does not have a gun. I watch the demilitarized pine trees filter the sun like a ceiling fan. I watch demilitarized cranes land on a lake so bright it makes me blink. The demilitarized conductor bows as he enters each train car. An old woman sits with demilitarized bundles wrapped in pink. At Pyongyang, I stop for demilitarized noodles. The Taedong River is not full of bodies. The sun in the trees makes a noise like ee, ee. The sparrows in the buckwheat fields shout in Bukhan accents and no guns. At Uiju, the platform is demilitarized. The taxi stand is not pockmarked with mines. I buy a demilitarized barley tea, and the shopkeeper hands me my change like she's responsible for me. In the demilitarized record hall, I hand over a slip of demilitarized paper, and the clerk smiles at my accent. You've traveled a long way, she says, as she leads me to the demilitarized stacks. We find my family's genealogy book. We turn to the last generation recorded before the world ended and our line split south. I unfold my paper with the list of missing names. The clerk copies the letters as I read them. Together, we demilitarize my family. The sun coming in through the windows says, ah, ah. Thank you all so much.
That poem is, they were all so beautiful, but that one just like really brings tears to my eyes. Autumn, would you like to read next?
I just want to kind of hear Franny read.
I know. Tough act to follow.
Yeah. You're so brilliant. It's always such a gift to hear your words and be around your community building. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in the Zoom world. I'm currently at the Swanee's Writer Conference, thus the dorm room I'm in, but I couldn't miss this reading because you know, I'm a huge fanboy of Franny, but also it's meant so much to be a part of this project. If I could have told my teenager self, who was trying so hard to assimilate and forget my Koreanness, that at one point I would get to be a part of a Korean American community where I didn't have to leave a part of myself behind, I wonder what kind of teenager that person could have been. And for many of you, you know, for many of us, I think we were asking ourselves, what do we do with all this anti-social violence happening? And I'm so grateful that this project came up, that art reminded us again of how uplifting and amplifying our voices and making room for all of our different stories is a way that we can respond to the violence happening. And you know, it's been pretty inspiring to see all the different ways that people have raised their voices in light of everything that's going on. And I hope that it's a practice that we can continue. I'm at the University of the South, which occupies Shawnee and Cherokee land. And I want to make this land acknowledgement as a move for us to name systemic racism and white supremacy, right? Because naming it is the only way for us to change it. I'm going to start my poem with the poem that was part of the Jeong portfolio. And I think a lot of the reason I wrote it because there's just no representation of queer Asian people growing up. I think the first queer Korean American person I met was when I was 27. And I remember just walking in the streets of Manhattan afterwards, just like ugly crying, you know? But that was a life-changing moment. So this is after a poem by Jean Ann Verlee, who, if you don't know, she's an incredible poet. I highly recommend checking her out. It's called Unsolicited Advice for the Queer Asians Just Trying to Make It. When your mother forces you out of the car, let her. When she tries to apologize years later for doing so, let her. When you're old enough to understand that mistakes can be well-intentioned, answer the phone. When she calls your girlfriend your roommate, plan on inviting her back for the next holiday. When she asks, is the man you went to lunch with is your boyfriend, simply say no. When you want to let your anger swallow anybody small or close enough, remember that change takes a long time. When she ignores your fiance when making introductions, remember how at least she asks about her when she calls. When at your wedding, she sees you're both loved and belong, don't remind her of everything that's come before. When she finally tells your wife she loves her, let yourself cry. All the longing built from 10 years of waiting, let her see your tears and try to forgive her and yourself for letting it take this long. My sister just had a baby, which is like so huge. It's such a big, moment for our family. And I've been posting, all about my Sid kid, Gael, online. And I think, and I came out to my family as trans, and I'm starting T and top surgery through telling them the gender neutral word for ants I wanted to go by. And I think social media has this way of making it seem so easy, right? Like, oh, cool, your family is so supportive, awesome. But I think it's so important to talk about the journey that we took to get here, right? And I remember when I first came out to my mom, she threatened to kill herself. And then we moved all the way to this, right? So I don't want to make it seem all good. I don't want to let social media do its thing where it's like all of a sudden Korean mom totally accepting, right? Because that's not what it is. And that I'm going to read 2 new poems that aren't from the book. And this one is called When You Put on Your Binder Smelling Like Lavender. When you put on your binder smelling like lavender, it's the same day you call yourself by your old pronouns, as if they were makeup you could put on in the dark, or shoes that don't pinch if you stand still, or the way you pick up the phone using your ex's last name. Your mother's arsenal of gender-neutral words for children grows each day like tomatoes bursting green in your mouth. And when you say thank you, she'll act like it's no big deal. Say, of course, and erase the months it took to tell her, or how she's always the last one to know. You have big plans on how you'll tell her about top surgery, how you'll call it back pain. Then in a few months, explain how you've been waiting so long, like how you dream about dancing in a crowded hall when the pandemic breaks, or the houseplants you move to the sunniest corners every season. You search the internet for more musky scents, bergamot and sandalwood, get annoyed to see lotion gendered, like necklaces and watches and jeans and t-shirts and journals and camping gear and shampoo and coffee mugs. And you think maybe you should go back to pretending you are fine with the long hair and the big boobs and pants with fake pockets, like you're watching a butterfly hatch and hoping it'll never break through its cocoon or never see its wings or know that they can spread wide and hide them when the big hawk comes, or the years of training yourself to ignore your chest as if it were a borrowed book, or the Tupperware you have to return to the neighbor, or the stain on the carpet everyone just walks around. The real question is, do you wear your binder to the new hairdresser who is Korean and might look at the picture of the bearded actor you bring in like it's kimchi on a hamburger, and who might have a store full of Korean ajumas who will stare and make small efforts to whisper, or she will be like your mom, not understanding you, but not hating it, tilting her name at all she cannot name. You're either gutting the fish and leaving it for flies, or shoveling the snow off the sidewalk so you can get to your mailbox. But either way, you need to get your hair cut back from its quarantine shag so you soothe your dry skin, flatten your chest so you can bear the mirror and walk out the door. Okay, cool. I'm gonna read one more poem. So it's so interesting to try to translate things into Korean when the concept itself doesn't exist in Korean. Like, as many of you know, Korean is like a super gendered language, right? And people feel a lot of pride in the different names that they're given. And, I do love and appreciate how relational it is, and that's awesome. But I'm also really struggling with like, what does it mean to translate being non-binary, being trans into a language that doesn't just hold those concepts in and of itself. So this poem is called The Right Word. I was 18 the first time I got a tattoo, following this one law as if it was a straight line and it didn't mind the ruler. When my mother finally saw the inked leaf on my ankle, she said nothing and walked into the kitchen, which is to say, what could I expect raising children in America? Or the counter needs to be wiped again, or good thing my mother can't see us now. The counselor calls to say I'm a season away from dropping out. My mother's forehead to the mouthpiece, and she's saying, yes, I understand, which is to say, a backhand needs no words, or I never wanted this, or I am a bowl held together by a seam. I traveled to Korea for 6 months to learn her language. All I come back with is a word for that week in spring when the petals rain down and pillow the sidewalks in pink. The purple dusk right when the tree branches turn black, the name of my uncle's cousin's son, and I say, Mom, I missed you. Which is to say, I'm not brave enough to say this in a language I can't hide in, or I've missed you my whole life, or let's forget everything. The lonely Christmas tree, the pale cutting board, the phone flying through the air. The first summer I could smell, after 27 years of not, I sit on a back porch, darker than my mother likes me from the sun, dizzy with a rupture of peach, my friend running between the porch and kitchen with my favorite sweater, raspberries, a cap, a cinnamon. My mother calls in the middle of this and I say, Mom, it smells so good. By which I mean, this peach is like a summer body unafraid of its want, or I'm watching the darkness fall to its knees, or remember that one time we laughed together like this. She says, I'm happy for you. Good job. Which is to say, the sky here is a bird's blue. Or do you know the Korean word for wish? Or what I would give to be next to you, smelling something for which you will never find a name. Thanks, y'all. Much love.
So amazing. I just feel so lucky to be in conversation with you two. I think that, you know, the concept of Jeong for me was a fairly recent thing that I've learned of. My mother's Korean, my father's white, and I didn't grow up speaking Korean, though I was around a lot of Koreans. And so once I realized there was a word for this feeling, this kinship that you have with Koreans, it felt like, oh, it makes sense. And I would love to hear from both of you how, like, what does Jeong mean to you? And how have you kind of felt that show up in your own lives and in your work?
How's your rice? 밥 맛있어?
맛있어. Yeah, sorry to everybody who had to watch me shovel kind of ice into my mouth. But I will get hangry otherwise, but yes, thank you.
I'm so glad you're eating. That feels very appropriate.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like, yeah, this is great. Like, literature is amazing, community is amazing, but like, you have to eat. So yeah, right. Alex, that's such a beautiful question to start with. And I love thinking about Jeong, especially as like people often cite Han as like the Korean feeling, like the Korean affect, the thing that like structures all of our feeling, and I like deeply relate to Han, and like that concept has been really enriching and clarifying, and yeah, just like has really provided a place for a lot of my my feelings of like everything from intergenerational trauma to feminine silencing and etc., everything in between, and like the legacy of colonialism. And at the same time, like I think that like, I feel like there's been this kind of move also to say like recently among in Korean and Korean American circles to say like, okay, like Han is like very important and great, but not great, but like very important as like a structuring feeling, but also like Jeong is as like the antidote, or not the antidote, but kind of like as a counterbalance to that. Like, is it possible to say that like Jeong is as that this feeling of kinship and love and care and community is just as much of a Korean thing as like our trauma, that feels really important to me. And I've also been thinking about it recently as like, especially in picking out like poems to read this tonight, it came up again, is like, can we also think of Jeong as going beyond just like Koreanness, but also like what if Jeong is extended out to people that are beyond who we might immediately see as our people, then maybe Jeong also is like a feeling of what other people might call like solidarity, like to say, you are my people, you are my people, even if we aren't literally like the same people in certain ways, to say you are my people. And I think like the ability of saying to people with whom I was in community, you are my people, and therefore I care about your liberation as much as I care about mine. And to have people say that to me has just been like the most life-saving kind of grace of my life.
Yeah, I love that you bring up Han too. I learned from Sun Young-shin that there are some theories that Han was actually a concept introduced by Japanese colonizers as a way to be like, see, this is your condition, right? This is your destiny to engage with hardship, to like explain some of the trauma that came from colonization. And I love what that like really tripped me up for a while. But I love what you're saying, like, Jeong is a counterweight of Jeong being just as important, right? We are more than the sum of our oppression, was something that Vanessa Hua was saying in a lecture earlier, where she was actually talking about one of Franny's poems. And to me, I think the moments I've experienced Jeong, so I went to college in a very white place, and then moved to Korea for 6 months afterwards as a, like, antidote. And I remember that feeling so clearly of being on the subway in Seoul and looking around and be like, oh, this is what I'm gonna look like when I get older. Like, oh, like these characteristics are not just mine. They're like of a people, they're my people. And I never felt a sense of belonging like that, where it's like, has nothing to do with preference or shared experiences or even language, right? But it was just a connection that exists. And I think as a queer first gen person of color growing up in a very white space, like that feeling of not having to explain your experience to someone, but that like inherent connection was such medicine, right? I also think about two queer organizations in New York where it really helped me feel like I can be a part of the Korean community. I don't have to leave behind my queerness in order to belong with the Asian American community. I don't have to leave behind my Asian Americanness to belong with the queer community. And these two organizations were really life-changing. One is a Tari project, which they put together an anthology of all these queer Korean American narratives, which is awesome. And the other is KQTCon, which is the first Korean queer trans conference that existed, and it was in New York a couple years ago. And there are all these Korean moms like giving out hugs. It was just like, I didn't go get a hug because I was like crying too much, but just the idea of like a hug from this mom who's made this journey to be able to express love towards queer, people who are younger than her, felt almost the same as if my mom was to give me that hug. Like, I think that to me is what is kind of encapsulated in this idea of Jeong, is obviously it's not my mom, right? But something about a Korean mom being able to love me like as I am felt so healing. But yeah, I love how complicated this question is and this phrase is.
It really is. And something Franny was saying about kind of extending this concept of Jeong to people who maybe are not Korean, or, feeling this sort of sense of solidarity or kinship or lineage with people who are not necessarily strictly Korean in the literal sense. It reminds me of your poem, Arhm, that you read first, because it made me think about like the ways in which, you know, sometimes our people can't show up for us in one way or another in the ways that we need them to, or maybe it just takes them longer. And I would love to hear you talk about like the ways in which you have sought out kinship in other ways and how that's affected your work.
Yeah, it's interesting because chosen family feels like a huge thing, not only obviously, you know, with first generation, with immigrant families, but also within the queer family, and how important that can be. I think it's been, man, I don't know about y'all, but I didn't learn about Korea or Korean writers in high school or any K through 12 education. I didn't even learn about the Korean War until grad school. Um, so finding other mentors and other lineages felt huge. And I think a lot of that was through the slam community. I grew up in Ann Arbor, and my family was going through. My mom was a single mom. I was helping raise my little sister. And it feels very Korean to be like, yeah, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about our dirty laundry. Like, you're just going to have this fun where things are great. And so that relief in finding the slam community where they were actually talking about real things happening. I mean, I know it sounds corny, but it was life-saving in a lot of ways to hear people say that truth. And to me, Jean Ann Lee is like such a role model in that. Her poetry talks a lot about trauma, a lot about sexual assault. And I think that, you know, misogyny and the patriarchy lead to a lot of why we don't talk about sexual assault. So her voicing it so clearly feels like a direct move to reduce sexual violence within people's experiences. So I grappled a lot with what it means to talk about trauma. My first book is a lot about my abusive father and his alcoholism, and really grappling with like, what right do I have to call trauma back up into the air? So Jean Ann Lee, you know, I think other poets like Rachel McKibben, really help create my guidelines for why am I doing this? Why is it important to me? So I definitely am looking for other people who have are like on this or can help guide me in my journey. So of course everything I learned in school was like all dead white men, right? And I was like, we're talking about a Grecian urn, there's this albatross, like why do I care? You know, it means nothing to me. So this act of like finding people that spoke to my experiences felt like an act of resistance, but also an act of survival.
Adam, I love that you bring up people like Jean Ann and Rachel, who have definitely been like beacons for me as well. And I also like the one, I like Jean Ann's work is like particularly amazing to me because like there's her poem, the poem of hers called Brawler, which I have taught in like a bunch of different settings, bringing poetry workshops into schools and community spaces. And like everywhere that I've brought this poem, students have been like, wow, that really speaks to me. And it's like, it's about growing up like in, where did she grow up? Like Maryland, Virginia, somewhere in that kind of like a sort of like rural trailer park kind of background. And I brought it to like a group of students at like an alternative school in New Mexico, and they were like, yeah, that's my experience. Like that, I totally relate to this. I brought it to a group of like high school students in Detroit, and they were like, this is obviously about Detroit because like I completely relate to this. And I think that there's like there are these, like sometimes I think it has to do with like a kind of struggle, and maybe particularly like kind of like class struggle. Maybe, you know, it has to do with like the commonalities of our experiences and the impressions that that have like shaped our lives. And I think that there's also like there are certain ways that I think poetry allows us to kind of be really like hyper specific and also get to that common like throbbing hurt heart at the same time. And like, that is, I don't know, I just feel so grateful for that. And so like, yeah, I mean, I think that all of us as poets and as artists have been deeply influenced and like, and had our lives and our artistic visions shaped by people who, whose experiences were in some, you know, in many ways, like not at all like our own. And like, thank God that this is possible, because like you said, queer family, chosen family wouldn't happen without that, you know, wouldn't be possible without that.
So Franny, I'd love to talk to you about your poem that you submitted for the portfolio, and specifically about the word demilitarized, because it's a word that I think that I'm not sure I've ever heard it in a context other than North and South Korea. Like, I think that's the only context I've ever heard it. And it reminds me, the way that the word kind of invades the poem reminds me a lot of the way that people, strangers, would jokingly ask, like, oh, is your family from North or South Korea? Like, it's like a funny thing. Not understanding the history, not understanding the way families were divided. So I'd love to hear you talk about like what that word means to you, and yeah, and how it kind of informed the shape of the poem.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that question. And I'll also say that the print that Sunny, the artist that was in collaboration with me, who made this beautiful print broadside of this poem, like she did an incredible, amazing job. And so, yeah, I was just like very moved by it. And in that version of it, the word demilitarized, like has like this yellow that kind of like does sort of invade the whole page of that gradually. And so yeah, but yeah, I mean, I too have also never exactly, you know, I think of it as like part of demilitarized zone, and you know, weirdly, the demilitarized zone is like in some ways like heavily militarized, right? Like it's like it's like it's one of like the world's most militarized borders. But within that, you know, like 1 kilometer wide space, there's at the same time, you know, like a ton of mines and tunnels, and people do go into that space, like troops from both sides do go into that space. But also it's like, because you're not supposed to be in that space, it's like kind of this wildlife preserve where like it's largely untouched, and so the wildlife, plants, etc., kind of get to flourish because of the lack of human intervention. And I think that like that, thinking about that and understanding the potential, like the thing that happens in this like in this space that is made from war, colonialism, division, trauma, that is like guarded on so many sides by heavy military, and then also that is the thing that allows it to flourish. Like it just kind of it sort of broke my brain a little bit. And so yeah, I mean, I guess I just started thinking about like, okay, what if like that sort of space of sanctuary, if not the other stuff around it, but what if that like sense of sanctuary were to expand? Like if it's small, it can be bigger, you know? And so that was the sort of like impetus for the poem. And, you know, I think also in using that word over and over again, I think it's sort of a reminder to myself as well that like a dream of a reunified Korea, or a dream of like a more porous border in Korea, or whatever it is, like that doesn't mean like now there's one huge military complex, right? It doesn't. And like similarly, when it comes to all of the borders, all of the heavily militarized and policed borders in the world, whether that's the US-Mexico border or the various borders that exist in between Israel and Palestine, the occupied Palestine, that it's not that taking those down doesn't mean like, yeah, like let's just have the military like facilitate all the shit that goes on. It means that like it's a demilitarization project. It's an anti-capitalist project, etc. Yeah.
So fascinating. we are open for questions if anybody wants to submit questions. We do have one question that is not about art necessarily, though it is about wearable art. Somebody asks if Franny, if you made your top.
I did make my top. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
That's
it's a cotton lawn from Stone Mountain and Daughters, which is a great independently run fabric store somewhere, I think in Seattle. Is that true? Anyway, yeah.
What is the pattern?
It's it's like I think it's the M not 7979. I don't remember what the number is. Yeah, it's a McCall's pattern, but I modified it to be waist ties.
Oh my gosh.
Rather than
Amazing. I started making my clothes during the pandemic, so it's been like incredibly empowering. It's just like so much fun to make things that fit your body.
Yeah, totally. And to just like learn stuff and be like, oh, like that's how, wow, I did not put that zipper in. Well, now I know, yeah.
You've been remaking a lot of like Korean style clothes, right?
I did a little bit. Yeah, there was one, some of the early stuff that I was doing, my earlier work.
My early work.
Well, some of the first things I tried to make were just like copying clothes I already had, like recreating clothes I already had. And so there's one that was like a more modern hanbok skirt that I tried to like copy and recreate and stuff. It didn't end up, it turned out okay, but yeah. But I think also like, I don't know, I think that it's like trying to figure out how to incorporate like traditional Korean elements into the clothes that I'm making has been a big part of it. Yeah.
That's amazing. We have a question from Julia. Let's see. When do you think about your audience when you're making your work?
That's a great question.
Oh, so many questions coming in. So exciting.
Arhm, do you want to take this audience one? Because I know that, I am such a big admirer of the ways that your work is so deeply entangled with community. And so I would love to hear you talk about audience.
I would say the exact same thing about you. I will never forget the moment. So I decided to go to Sarah Lawrence for my MFA because the only Korean American professor in an MFA program was at Sarah Lawrence. And I'll never forget Kathy Park Hong telling me that I'm writing for white audiences and asking me why. I was like, what do you mean? Oh my God, you're so right. I can't believe all that truth came out. And it completely changed how I was writing because I was overwriting all these things to try to make my experiences legible to a white audience, right? And ever since then, I've thought a lot about that, and it really has changed my writing. And I think that's a lot of the reasons why I decided not to translate the Korean words in my book until the glossary at the end, because I wanted to signal that this is for a Korean and mainly a Korean American audience. And then you have to do the work of like experiencing what it's like to not understand the word and then go to the glossary and look for the word if you wanted to know what the word meant. But I've also been thinking a lot about translating my book into Korean, which I never wrote the book thinking that my mom would fully understand it. And I'm really grappling with that question. Because again, I wrote it for a Korean American and a queer audience, but there is like a burgeoning queer community in Korea, which is why I'm interested in translating the book. But the second question, Leah, is about, I've been thinking a lot about, at the conference, some kimchi showed up on some salmon. And I was like, do I love or hate this? And I'm so perplexed by this question, right? And a lot of times my friends are like, oh, I made kimchi. I was like, you made sauerkraut or you made pickled vegetables. Because kimchi takes a long ass time.
Right. And sometimes people don't use the right peppers. They'll use like Thai peppers and be like, I made kimchi. It's like, no, you didn't.
Oh my God, or like sriracha.
Cabbage. Yeah. Oh, no. What? No.
No, right?
So weird.
Yeah, but Franny, I'm curious that you would speak to that. I think especially with this question too that Leah asked about, just creating an Asian spaces feel different now that K-pop is everywhere. BTS is like being sold at McDonald's nationally. What do you think?
I mean, it's such an interesting question. I mean, I think that in some ways, like, I think in some ways, like one has to do a little bit less explaining. So, like, and that little part, if like I can hold on to one bit of blessing in it, it's like, like I think that I grew up telling people I'm Korean, people being like, what's that? And like I remember the first time I heard like a Korean food mentioned on TV, and I in that moment was like, wow, that's like really random. Like, why would you know about that? And now like people just say the word, like just say KBBQ, you know what I mean? Like, or like, and all of the things that you mentioned too. I think that it is, it's sort of like on the one hand, there are also like challenges as well to like not kind of like tokenize or exotify yourself in, there's like there becomes like a few more traps maybe to like trip over in that sense. But also, I don't know, I kind of love the fact that like in that first poem that I read, when I said like I say K-pop, and like that people know what that is or have an image in their mind, like I don't know, it's also kind of cool as well. So yeah, I wrestle with it.
I feel like it lets us take more risks in some way because
Mhm.
the standard is different now. It's not like we're getting made fun of for bringing king in our lunch boxes, right? Now there's like 3-year-old white kids like running around with seaweed packets. Like, does that liberate us a little bit to like be ourselves, that edit or assimilation? Like, is it still appropriation? Yes, because there's still this power dynamic, right? But yeah, I wonder how we can take the best parts of it and try to our hardest to raise our voices about the parts that are problematic about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's, as much as we can be like, oh, you want to talk about Korean stuff? Like, sure, let's talk about some Korean, like as much as we can use that as like the way to kind of like leapfrog over into the things that are really urgent to talk about. I mean, I think that shit is really hard to do, but maybe, I have hope.
Right. Like, let's use BTS to talk about anti-Blackness or the
Yeah.
intense history of colonization or
Yeah. Or like the weird ways that like gender works in Korea and in desire in Korean pop culture and like in formulations of masculinity, like let's like use it all to talk about all of that.
right, like boys are holding hands there.
Yeah.
Because like queerness is just like, not a question, right? There's just this assumed straightness of everyone, but it's so beautiful too, though, and I wish we could have that in our American culture as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have a bunch of questions, but I know we're also running up against time. So I want to ask this question. This is somebody's question, and then also tie in my own question. So when I have these events where people are being sort of held up to share their work, I love to bring the outside world in. So I would love to. Okay, so first the question is, what does Koreanness of the future look like to you? And the second part is, who are your favorite Korean or Korean American artists and writers that you'd like to shout out?
I love this.
I mean, I think the future is us, right? Like, I feel like we are poised to articulate and name so many things that our parents couldn't. And that feels extremely powerful and like resonant with possibility. Um, Favorite Korean or Korean American art, Holland is this queer K-pop singer who I'm obsessed with.
Mhm.
Um, And then for Korean American artists, I mean, obviously Franny Choi is North Star and guiding light. EJ Ko is obviously someone who's impacted, and I just admire her work so much. Marcy Canciel Bello, who's our Ox is incredible. It's just so amazing to see more and more of us coming out into the world. You know, getting this fellowship at the Swanee Writers Conference, I was like, ooh, is it going to be one of those experiences where it's like I'm the only or one of the few? And there's actually quite a number of Korean Americans here, which is really awesome. So we were all like judging the kimchi and the salmon the other day. But I think that's the future of finding each other, of using the internet to connect. And I think, you know, feeling less lonely. I really, really hope that that is the Korean future in store for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to that point about like using yeah, sort of finding each other. I don't know, I'm reminded of the ways that Korean queerness and queer liberation and community building was like so facilitated by the advent of the internet, that like message boards became like a was like a historically important way that LGBTQ people in Korea were able to start finding each other, and then like start gathering to have the first pride parades and forming spaces and stuff. So that like yeah, these things that facilitate us to be able to find each other, whether they're like digital technology or events like this, like they're real and life-saving and big. But I guess the future of what does the Korean future look like? I mean, I think that it's like one where we like are continuing to really put a lot of energy into our own healing, and also into really questioning the ways that our sort of like post-colonial trauma manifests as sometimes as like having becoming a sort of colonial force in East and especially in Southeast Asia. Like I think I take a lot of heart from the like revolutionary and radical politics that existed in both North and South Korea, and like have hope for the ways that can push the home country and the diaspora into just like being a more liberated and radical and progressive Korean diaspora. Yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, I see a queer Korea, I see a trans Korea, I see an anti-colonial Korea, and I guess I'll shout out Donmi Choi, another Choi, a third excellent Choi, and Emily Jungmin Yoon are also two other Korean American poets or Korean diasporic poets whose work are really guide me. Yeah. Oh, and Suji Kwak Kim, of course, the goat Suji. Yeah, who I think is coming out, has like another book in the works coming out. Yeah, I think it'll have been like 10 years, but yeah, I think we're about to get more Suji in the streets. So yeah.
Amazing. I'm just so grateful for both of you, for your work, for everything that you do. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to KAAC for organizing this and for everybody for coming. Yeah, all the places to find you are on the Instagram posts that are all over the KAAC Instagram account. So if you want to follow people, you can find them there. And I'm sure there are emails that are going to go out at some point. So yes. But thank you everybody so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was so beautiful.
Oh, I think we do have an outro. Am I right? Yes, Julie.
So that was amazing. Thank you everyone for such a wonderful event. We're so grateful for the time that we spent together tonight talking about Jeong. Many thanks to our sponsors for allowing us to put on this event, including the nonprofit organization Poets and Writers, as well as our generous Indiegogo backers. Thanks to Alex for moderating this event, and thanks to our writers for so generously reading their work and participating in this conversation. I saw a comment that said it was like medicine, and I think that's so true. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today, and thank you and good night. Are we gonna take a selfie or a group shot or?
Sure.
Sure. I think we did that last.
Oh no, we lost Franny. Oh no.
Oh, is it?
Oh, are we gonna do a whole
I think
big group thing?
Rearranging us, maybe.
Right.
Or just kidding, I'm not sure. Should I take it?
I
Try
don't
to
think,
rearrange.
I don't think we have to do a group shot because I took a million screenshots.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. Well
Amazing.
then, thank you everyone so much. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much,
y'all.
everyone. This was
Thank you, guys.
awesome.